The Vietnam War was a battleground not just on the ground, but in the skies, a conflict in which air power became a decisive force in an unforgiving jungle war. From the deafening roar of F-4 Phantoms streaking across the sky to the relentless drum of Huey helicopters ferrying troops into the unknown, aircraft shaped the very nature of the fight. Through daring tactics, groundbreaking innovations, and relentless challenges, pilots and air crews waged a high-stakes chess game of aerial warfare to control the skies over Vietnam, where every mission could mean the difference between survival and disaster. It remains the longest war in American history and the only one from which the USA did not emerge victorious. A greater tonnage of bombs was dropped than in the Second World War. Hundreds of thousands of rockets were launched, and millions of artillery shells and bullets were expended. It was the war in which the helicopter came into its own, and where every type of aircraft was used. A special force of USAF Air Commandos was created with a new uniform which included a bush hat. After training at the Air Force's biggest stateside base, Eglin in Florida, they went to South Vietnam where they began to train the infant VNAF, the Vietnamese Air Force. The VNAF used aircraft insignia resembling that of the USA, but with sidebars of red and yellow instead of blue and white. Much of the early tactical instruction was done in the T-28D, a trainer with performance similar to that of a World War II fighter. It could carry unguided rockets, hundreds of rounds of ammunition for .50 caliber heavy machine guns, and various bomb loads including light practice bombs. Big 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets and 100-pound bombs could easily be loaded onto the pylons under the wings of a B-26B. These versatile attack bombers were often older than their pilots, but against ill-equipped troops, they were formidable. Together with the smaller T-28D, they began the process of plastering Vietnam with rockets, gunfire, and bombs. If they could see a target, weapons delivery could be quite accurate. Both types also flew many training missions. Though hitting the targets on the ranges was a world away from in-country airstrikes, it was helpful practice. One weapon that hardly needed accuracy was napalm, a tank full of jellied naphtha and palm oil that if it hit human skin would go on burning, even underwater. Air transport was going to be important in Vietnam, where there were few roads. The little U-10A could drop up to 6 paratroops. Its other advantage was that it could operate from short and rough airstrips. The bigger C-47 could carry far more men and equipment. It was used particularly in the early years for the transport of Green Beret Special Forces in support of the Vietnamese Civilian Irregular Defense Group program. Especially on a hot day, a loaded C-47 would have to make a RATO, a rocket-assisted takeoff. When the rockets had burned out, they would be jettisoned. As for the whale-like C-46D, this needed every ounce of thrust from its 2,000 horsepower engines to make a full-load takeoff. Only one combat parachute jump was made in March 1967 by the 173 Airborne Brigade during Operation Junction City near the Cambodian border. Meanwhile, in the early years, the T-28Ds and the B-26s kept up their sustained attacks on the elusive enemy in South Vietnam. The U.S. was becoming progressively more involved in the war, both on the ground and in the air. Various types of helicopters, including transport, attack, and reconnaissance models, played a vital and central role in numerous operations and battles throughout the duration of the war. The oldest were the Sikorsky H-34 piston-engine transports, and many were given to the VNAF. Powered by a 1,500-horsepower Cyclone engine, the H-34 could typically airlift 16 troops and their equipment. Flying at low level at about 90 miles per hour, it was usual to leave the side door open and fit a heavy .50 caliber machine gun. Supply missions were flown to the many fortified hamlets with which the government forces sought to control the countryside. Because the hamlets were mainly in remote areas, most supplies were brought in by helicopter, and these included sacks of rice and, on occasion, camp followers. Altogether, more than 10,000 helicopters were used in the Southeast Asian theater, where they became the workhorse of the infantry. Only a few of them made it back to the USA. In 1965, the U.S. Air Force, which had not itself bucked the neat little Northrop F-5 Freedom fighter for its own use, leased a dozen of these supersonic machines and formed them into a unit called the Scotia Tigers. Initial training was done at Williams Air Force Base in the States, and they left for Vietnam in October 1965. 2 months later, they were in action against Viet Cong positions near Saigon. The useful load of 750-pound bombs and rockets had a devastating effect on Viet Cong ambush positions along South Vietnam's highways. Reported enemy concentrations were also the subject of airstrikes with both bombs and cannon. Increasingly, the U.S. involvement was becoming a full-scale war. Big and bold, the North American F-100 Super Sabre bore a mighty burden in both the attack and fighter roles. In 1953, it had been the world's first supersonic fighter. 13 years later, it was still in frontline service. In 1966, F-100s of the 531st Tactical Fighter Wing at Bien Hoa Air Base were flying almost round the clock. They were never parked in the open, but in blast-proof revetments, safe except for a direct hit from above against VC mortar or rocket attacks. Armed with snake-eye retarded bombs, the Super Sabres were adept at low-level strike missions. Most of the U.S. Army's aircraft were helicopters. An exception was the twin-turboprop Grumman OV-1 Mohawk, a battlefield reconnaissance plane with about the speed and agility of a wartime Spitfire and the ability to use short, rough airstrips. Slow-flying Mohawks often sustained damage. With one engine dead, an emergency landing was necessary, as at Binh Thuy Air Base. Some Mohawks carried weapons, but their main purpose was to use the big bug-eye windows and cameras to keep the generals literally in the picture. The C-47 was also used in the Psy-War role. Showering the country with leaflets was part of the policy of winning the hearts and minds of the population, and especially the VC soldiers. The U-10B was also used for this purpose and could carry a powerful loudspeaker as well as bundles of leaflets. As the war went on, leaflets tended to be replaced by firepower. The air war in Vietnam saw the introduction of a weapon unique in warfare. Because of the difficulty of never seeing the enemy among the foliage, Operation Pink Rose was mounted to determine the techniques and conditions needed to defoliate the jungle. Some experiments were made to destroy the vegetation by fire. In the main, though, specially equipped UC-123B transports, holding formation at low level, put down wide swaths of chemical defoliant. Particular attention was paid to suspected VC lines of communication, and these naturally included the hundreds of miles of trails in the highlands and also the coastal waterways in South Vietnam. Between 1962 and 1971, over 19 million gallons were sprayed in what were called ranch hand missions. Nobody appreciated at the time that Agent Orange, the commonest chemical used, would have adverse medical effects on millions of people, including probably the U.S. veterans of Vietnam. Of all aircraft in action in Vietnam, the greatest was unquestionably the McDonnell F-4 Phantom. It was first built as a high-altitude carrier-based interceptor for the Navy and Marines. Among those Air Force units which flew the F-4C version in Vietnam were the gunfighters of the 366th Tactical Fighter Wing. Their Phantoms carried 4 Big Sparrow air-to-air missiles, 6 Mark 82 bombs, a center-lined gun pod, and 2 drop tanks. Capable of flying at twice the speed of sound, the Phantom could knock down North Vietnamese MiG fighters as well as making effective ground attacks. The gunfighters were based at Da Nang, one of the huge permanent air bases constructed by the U.S. in Vietnam. To support the war's continuous air operations, vast tonnages of bombs had to be assembled and stored. In getting ready for a mission, the selected mix of bombs were jacked up and attached below the aircraft. To maximize the load the aircraft could carry, special multiple pylons were often used where 3 bombs could be fitted to the same hard point. Once the bombs were safely attached to the aircraft, the fuses were armed and fitted in the nose of each weapon. Da Nang was also home to Martin B-57Bs, the U.S. version of the British Canberra light bomber, which was also flown in Vietnam by the Royal Australian Air Force. B-57s put down 1,000-pound bombs on targets in both North and South Vietnam, and could also strafe targets with their 4 20-millimeter cannon. The B-57 featured a heavy bomb load, amazing agility for such a large aircraft, and the ability to spend a long time at low level over the target. A special version, the B-57G, was packed with sensors which enabled it to make precision attacks on the darkest of nights. The tough C-123 providers, as well as defoliating the jungle, flew thousands of frontline resupply missions. You call, we haul was their motto, and they could fly in stores and equipment and up to 61 troops. On the return trip, 56 casualties could be brought out. Occasionally, the return cargo also included the scared kids who typified a high proportion of the VC irregular force prisoners. Such prisoners also arrived by Sikorsky HH-3C helicopter and were taken away for interrogation. Often the C-123s were called upon to para-drop supplies. However, it cannot have been too often that the loads included live cows. Some way off the coast of Vietnam, usually in the Gulf of Tonkin, giant carriers of the U.S. Navy made a massive contribution to American air power over Vietnam. Here aboard the mighty USS Constellation, the windshield of a Vought A-7A Corsair II is polished, ready for another mission with a load of Mark 82 bombs. On a carrier, every man on deck has a shirt whose color tells his job. Red shirts are ordnance men, and they live with bombs, fuses, and all that's dangerous. Everything on deck is choreographed like a ballet to get perhaps 90 planes loaded and blasted off in quick succession by the mighty steam catapults. As with land-based aircraft, various weapon loads could be fitted to the Navy's carrier-borne aircraft. Particularly hard work was loading the pods of the massive 5-inch rockets. The pilot will do his final walk-around check of his aircraft and its armament before he climbs aboard. It is up to him to check that all his weapons are ready for use. Every Navy pilot knows that a catapult launch, or cat shot, is so powerful that it would fling his loaded plane off the carrier's bows at full flying speed, even if his wheel brakes were locked. Different types of aircraft leave the carrier. An F-4J Phantom is slammed off the deck like a toy. Next is an A-4 Skyhawk attack aircraft, followed by another F-4. And then a huge RA-5C Vigilante reconnaissance plane. The A-7 subsonic attack aircraft was developed from the F-8 Crusader supersonic fighter. Both types saw action over North Vietnam. In many of these attacks, mighty Zuni rockets were fired from F-8E Crusaders. Their Navy pilots were trained to shoot down other aircraft with guns and missiles. Diving at the jungle was less satisfying because while a Zuni made an impressive bang, you never knew if you hit anything. In reality, the rockets followed such an erratic course There was never any possibility of actually making them hit a particular spot. In any case, there were always plenty of people down below firing back. At first, the North Vietnamese defenses were weak, but they gradually built up to become the strongest ever assembled, especially in the area around Hanoi and its port at Hai Phong. Even in the 1960s, thousands of light AA guns would fire on every attacker, just as the Soviet troops did on German aircraft in World War II. In exactly the same way, the sheer number of bullets and shells caused an unexpected number of American losses. Accordingly, the U.S. aircraft then tended to stay up about 10,000 feet. But the flak got heavier with guns of 37, 57, 85, and even 100 millimeters caliber reaching up to them. U.S. Navy No. 150826 had been a costly RA-5C Vigilante which automatically relayed back to the fleet hidden sharp radar pictures of the target. It would transmit no more. Up above it was as tough for the Navy and Marine Corps flyers as for anyone else. The attackers, flying F-80s, put down napalm on supposed VC concentrations in the jungle. Occasionally, one of the naps would break apart, a fragment arching high into the sky. Usually, the attack was just marked by the huge orange fireball. Douglas A-4C Skyhawks were also in action, making steep diving attacks on North Vietnamese ground installations. Other A-4s were in action. Executing a left turn, they transitioned into a half roll to reach an inverted position before aligning for an attack on the target area at Than Linh. Popularly known as the Scooter, the Skyhawk was a brilliantly simple jet attack aircraft that was in production from 1954 to 1979. Continuing their attacks, the leading Skyhawk releases a Zuni which wobbles and oscillates until it strikes the jungle precisely where it was intended to. The fortunate ones returned. An A-7A slams onto Constellation's deck and is violently halted by the arrestor cable. It was the final Navy attack mission against the North before Washington issued a bombing halt order on the 20th of November 1968. One group that never ceased was the Huey drivers. The Bell UH-1, officially known as the Iroquois, but universally referred to as the Huey, was the most widely used aircraft throughout the entire theater of war. Most of the robust, medium-sized helicopters in Vietnam were outfitted with a turboshaft engine, producing just over 1,000 horsepower. They could carry 14 troops or 6 littered casualties at approximately 113 miles per hour. Many in Vietnam were equipped with an armament system consisting of 4 M60 machine guns, 2 on each side, and 2 7-tube rocket launchers, all firing forward. The 2 0.75-inch folding fin aircraft rockets were part of the armament of the UH-1Bs of the Navy Helo Light Attack Squadron No. 3, known as the Sea Wolves, who were assigned to prevent the VC from infiltrating the canals and villages in the expansive Mekong Delta region. Operating in conjunction with small warships and hovercraft, the Sea Wolves enjoyed the advantage of mobility, allowing them to cover large areas of water, beach, mudflats, and often densely forested terrain. Targets, if they existed, were typically found in the jungle. This posed a central problem throughout the protracted Vietnam War. No one had developed a simple sensor capable of detecting the VC or even the regular North Vietnamese army as they stealthily navigated through the dense vegetation. Some attempts had been made with devices that relied on body heat or even perspiration, but the pilots and gunners up aloft had no such advantage. All they could do was attempt to imagine where the enemy might be and bombard the area with rockets, followed by forward-firing M60s. Meanwhile, the door gunner had his own M60 mounted on a pintle, allowing him to pivot through a wide arc. Even this crewman, who had an almost perfect view, rarely caught sight of the enemy. Statistically, some of the countless rounds fired should have hit someone. If the enemy was spotted by the infantry on the ground or from the air, smoke markers were deployed to indicate a likely aiming point. However, by the time firepower arrived, it did not necessarily mean that the VC were still present. Most of the extensive fleets of Hueys were owned by the U.S. Army, with many subsequently transferred to South Vietnam. The majority were employed in a transport capacity. A crucial role was the swift evacuation of casualties, or dust-off, from jungle clearings or rice paddies. Once on board, the injured soldier would be hurried to an aid station. A lower proportion of U.S. casualties perished in Vietnam compared to any previous war, and medical evacuation by helicopter significantly contributed to this. Hueys also transported troops into battle. A slightly larger version, the UH-1D, was operated in 1967 by, among other units, the 68th Assault Helicopter Company. The transport helicopters, known as SLICs, would approach their landing area in formation to facilitate the safe dispersal of their infantry. Few things in war are as overtly aggressive as the troop of helicopters thundering and clattering their way across the countryside, the door gunners firing almost continuously. The M60 machine guns often become nearly red hot as they spray 7.6 2mm bullets over the rice paddies, into huts, and through the trees. Up ahead, the LZ, the landing zone, is marked by colored smoke grenades. This type of mission is officially termed an insertion of ground forces. Once the infantry have departed the Hueys, the aircraft will be on their way again, their machine guns hosing down the surrounding countryside. Perhaps the most publicized battle of the war commenced on the 20th of January 1968, when North Vietnamese forces began encircling the forward Marine Corps base at Khe Sanh. One of the first outlying positions to fall was the Special Forces camp at Lang Vây. On the 5th of February, this camp was attacked by U.S. Air Force F-100s and F-4s, which used napalm and rockets from very low altitudes to ensure successful hits. The bloody battle raged on throughout the first quarter of 1968, and for 77 days, Khe Sanh was besieged with continuous artillery and mortar fire. The Marine garrison could only be supplied by air. This arriving Boeing Vertol CH-46C Knight was not going to linger. However, a Cessna O-2A light forward air control aircraft did arrive. C-123 providers brought in food and ammunition, often not stopping, even to unload cargo. The C-130 Hercules, another workhorse of Vietnam, also supported the base. These formidable aerial transporters would discharge their cargo and then roar back into the skies. With the North Vietnamese Army all around, the supersonic McDonnell RF-101C Voodoo Photo Recon aircraft worked round the clock. Some were shot down. Other casualties included Marine Corps A-4 Skyhawks. almost before the pilot's feet touched the ground, a Sikorsky HH-3C Jolly Green Giant rushed out to rescue him, sparing him from 5 years of mistreatment as a prisoner of war in what everyone referred to as the Hanoi Hilton. During World War II, many airdrops landed in the wrong locations, inadvertently providing vital supplies to the enemy. At Khe Sanh, the Herky birds targeted their 20-ton loads with accuracy measured in feet, a practice that was repeated in other airdrops over the following months. Following the lifting of the siege, the Army's Sikorsky CH-54 Tarhe flying crane helicopters delivered howitzers slung below. Precision drops by C-130s continued while Air Force Phantoms provided top cover. Occasionally, for instance, to retrieve casualties, C-130s had to brave the gauntlet and make a landing. Full reverse thrust from the propellers on the rough dirt airstrip enveloped the aircraft in dust. However, that did little to hinder the accuracy of the North Vietnamese Army's guns and mortars. This landing occurred in the A Shau Valley after the siege was lifted in May 1968. One of the aircraft transferred to the South Vietnamese was the Cessna A-35 Dragonfly, a light attack jet suitable for low strafing runs with its 7.62 millimeter minigun against exposed troops east of Quang Ngai City. The handover of this equipment formed part of the policy of Vietnamization, whereby the South Vietnamese forces were progressively trained to take over the fighting in the war. Another aircraft handed over was the 100-mile-per-hour Cessna 01E Bird Dog, a light plane. This pilot is briefed for a forward air control FAC mission and subsequently inspects his aircraft under the gaze of a U.S. instructor, highlighting the sizable smoke marker rockets. Perhaps the most effective of all was the Douglas A-1 Sky Raider. Designed by Ed Heinemann in 1944, the Sky Raider was one of his many creations, which included the wartime B-26 Invader and the A-4 Skyhawk. The A-1 Sky Raider was designed to take off from carrier decks for Navy missions, but in Vietnam it was utilized for almost everything and carried nearly anything, including, on one occasion, a suitably inscribed kitchen sink. Typical of VNAF Sky Raider operations were those conducted from Binh Thuy Air Base. They employed their 20-millimeter cannon rockets and bombs under the direction of the FAC, flying over the trees below in his little O-1E. VNAF Sky Raider attacks were one of the highlights of the transition of combat from America to South Vietnam. Republic Aviation's Mighty Thud, properly called the F-105 Thunder Chief, was one of the most respected battle wagons of the war. Though it had only one engine and one seat, this U.S. Air Force attack fighter was bigger, heavier, and more powerful than many bombers. Thus, it made more attack missions on heavily defended targets in North Vietnam than any other type, and its losses were proportionate to the task done. Some F-105Ds originated from the 34th Tactical Fighter Squadron at Korat Air Base in Thailand. Each aircraft carried 6 M117 bombs, which weighed considerably more than the stated figure of 750 pounds. Thud attacks were conducted against the rail yards at Kep, Viet Tri, and Yen Bai. Typical of the operations flown was a bullpup radio-guided missile strike on a barge located 30 miles northwest of Dong Ha. At the receiving end, every available gun that could be brought to bear was utilized, including a Soviet-supplied DSHK of 12.7 millimeter caliber. As soon as there is a brief lull, all personnel gather the empty casings and carry out essential maintenance on the weapons while fresh ammunition is brought up. In anticipation of further raids, the protective revetment is constructed to be stronger and higher. Water-filled craters gradually became a normal part of the Vietnamese landscape. F-105s targeted the Kep Khao Nang and Lang San rail yards north of Hanoi, employing 750-pound GP bombs. A significant amount of flak was returned from 37mm anti-aircraft guns. Once more, the thuds struck a rail bridge in the back Jiang complex, utilizing rockets as well as bombs. In October 1967, the F-105s struck the formidable Doomer Bridge near downtown Hanoi. This impressive bridge had withstood hundreds of assaults but ultimately succumbed when the precise laser-guided smart bombs of the paveway type were deployed. Airfields have always been a target that nobody could miss. While it is not easy to render a modern permanent airbase unusable, on this occasion the thuds were tasked with striking the large airbase at Phuc Yen. The primary weapons employed were M117 GP bombs, each weighing approximately 825 pounds. This took place in 1967. After 1970, no Thud or anything else would have dared to loiter in this airspace for fear of receiving at least one SAM, surface-to-air missile, up its jet pipe. In turn, the SAM missiles and their storage areas were later targeted by U.S. airstrikes. Probably half of all sorties flown after 1967 were directed against the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was not just one road, but many, winding their way through neighboring Laos on their journey to South Vietnam. Sophisticated sensors were developed in the Igloo White program to warn of the passage of every truck or even a cyclist. However, navigating the various trails was another matter. In the lowland areas, the trail faced constant assaults. In the highlands, choke points, such as the Mujia Pass, were major targets, as were easily identifiable roads. All types of missiles were fired at these targets in an attempt to close the trail and prevent supplies from reaching the south. Sadly, multi-million-pound supersonic fighters were not the ideal weapons for stopping individuals along paths through the rocky hills and forests. Engagement was easier when the target was visible. Before long, many of North Vietnam's bridges were rendered inoperable. They lacked neat, prefabricated military engineers' bridges. Everything was constructed the hard way, reminiscent of the bridge on the River Kwai. When sections of the Ho Chi Minh Trail were destroyed, immediate detours were created through the surrounding forest to bypass the cratered areas. Yet the one resource readily available to the north was manpower. With the help of both men and women, a local forest could quickly be transformed into a new bridge. Work on the trail or the bridges could be interspersed with fresh attacks, usually by F-4s flying at approximately the speed of sound, at altitudes too high for the barrage of local flak. Nevertheless, even rifles were still brought to bear against them. Rifles would have had even less effect on these monsters. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, the backbone of Strategic Air Command, played an increasingly significant role in Vietnam, beginning with the Arch Light missions in June 1965. Designed to carry a nuclear weapon, they were stripped down and rebuilt to transport vast quantities of conventional high-explosive bombs. The B-52D could carry 84 bombs internally and 24 on long external pylons, totaling about 89,000 pounds. The bombardment by the B-52s was something the Viet Cong despised, especially as the bombers flew so high they could neither be seen nor heard. Typical of these attacks were the strikes against North Vietnamese Army positions at Loc Ninh, situated approximately 68 miles northwest of Saigon. After Arclight came the Rolling Thunder missions, most of them grueling 12-hour round trips from the slippery runways on the overcrowded island of Guam, about 2,800 miles to the east in the Pacific. Powered by 8 large jet engines and manned by a crew of 6, the B-52 significantly increased the tonnage of high-explosive ordnance that was dropped on North Vietnam. As early as February 1965, shipments of Soviet SA-2SAMs began arriving at the port of Haiphong. Although these were among the most primitive and cumbersome SAM systems ever devised, dating back to the early 1950s, they were gradually deployed in such quantities in North Vietnam that they became a serious threat. In the final Linebacker II raids of December 1972, approximately 1,000 SA-2s were fired, downing at least 15 B-52s. Any crew members who fell into the hands of the North were in for a rough time. Fortunately, by 1972, they were unlikely to remain captives for long. The ill treatment of prisoners, often extending to outright torture, was never far from the minds of Allied aircrew. As soon as word arrived that a man was down, a rescue team would race to retrieve him. The usual team consisted of a Sikorsky UH-3C or 3E helicopter, commonly referred to as a Jolly Green Giant, specially equipped for rescue missions. It was accompanied by a Sandy, a Douglas A-1E Skyraider, which combined an abundance of weapons with remarkable toughness, along with the ability to loiter for hours at low altitude in support of the rescue helicopter. After a careful yet swift briefing, the team would scramble and head to the designated location on the map, which could be situated deep in the jungle. Many flight crew members carried small radio beacons. If they did not, the only chance was to spot a parachute among the treetops. The winchman would descend, sometimes utilizing a heavy device called a jungle penetrator to cut through the foliage and reach ground level. Within seconds, an uninjured rescuee would be on their way back up. The search was then on for the second crewman about a mile away, and with remarkable fortune, his parachute was clearly visible. Very quickly, the second man was hoisted up from certain captivity, ready for debriefing and to resume operations. Later, Sikorsky developed an immense helicopter, the HH-53 Super Jolly, boasting more than double the power, extensive armor and armaments, and in its final HH-53H configuration, the capability to rescue pilots at night, in fog, or during a blizzard. Throughout the Vietnam War, the beloved C-47 Goonie Bird undertook various missions. However, no one anticipated that it would assume a position in the battle line and engage the enemy with its firepower. The AC-47 version, known as Spooky or Puff the Magic Dragon, was equipped with 3 7.62mm miniguns aimed from the left side windows. Each could unleash 100 bullets per second. The concept was that as the pilot maintained a slow orbit in a banked turn to the left, the 3 miniguns would deliver a hail of fire upon a target on the ground. Early experiences with this pioneering gunship were promising. Next, there was a conversion of a jet-boosted variant of the C-123 transport, culminating in a genuine battleship of the skies. The 18,000 horsepower AC-130 Hercules was unlike any other combat aircraft before. Its guns still fired to the left as the monster made slow orbits around its target. Circling around ensured that the target was struck from all directions. Additionally, this aircraft was equipped with radar, sensitive infrared detectors, low-light television, and even a laser. on board, the crew could monitor everything happening on the ground from their various screens, whether on the darkest night or in the worst weather conditions. Upon locating a target, they could unleash a battery of guns arranged like those of an old-time galleon. Early versions had 4 miniguns and 4 Vulcan 20mm cannon pods. However, it evolved to feature 2 Vulcan pods, a 40mm Bofors gun and a massive 105mm howitzer. Against an enemy poorly equipped with anti-aircraft weapons, such an assault was utterly devastating. Tens of thousands of men engaged in aerial combat over Vietnam, unleashing millions of rounds with minimal tangible outcomes. With nearly all aircraft belonging to one faction, the conflict was fierce and challenging. It seems improbable that a war fought in the air on such an unbalanced scale will ever occur again.